Every year, hundreds of people go missing under baffling conditions in the woods of North America. One former police detective named David Paulides has investigated thousands of these strange disappearances, and he documents what he finds in his incredible book series called Missing 411. Today, we're going to look at 3 cases from the Missing 411 that might shed a light on what's behind all these strange disappearances. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel, because that's all we do, and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please go to the like button's house on a really hot day and ask them to get you a cold drink. While they're away, hide a large raw salmon in their haze. While they're away, hide a large raw salmon. I could feel it. I can feel it coming on. While they're away, hide a large raw salmon in the AC vent. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. West Townshend is a rural area on the east side of Glastonbury Mountain in the American state of Vermont. This is significant because that places West Townshend in the so-called Bennington Triangle, which is apparently one of the most haunted places in America. The Triangle is a loosely defined area that encompasses the ghost town Glastonbury, which used to be a small logging community centered on the eponymous mountain in southwestern Vermont. The town was abandoned at the end of the 19th century after the logging boom died down, so as a result, the greater Glastonbury area that West Townshend is certainly a part of is now untouched, pristine wilderness that even by Vermont standards is incredibly rugged and remote. The Triangle has earned its spooky reputation due in large part to the alarming number of unexplained disappearances that have occurred there over the last 100 years. Furthermore, over those 100 years, there have been dozens of sightings of the so-called Bennington monster, which is apparently this 8-foot-tall creature that roams the mountains of Glastonbury, and some people think that creature is behind many, if not all, of these strange disappearances. On November 23rd, 1943, 37-year-old Carl Herrick and his cousin Henry decided to go to West Townshend to do some deer hunting. At some point during their hunt, the pair got separated, and Henry spent some time yelling for Carl and looking around for him, but he couldn't find him, and so he assumed he must have gone back to their camp. But when Henry got back to camp, it was empty, and Henry waited around for a little while for Carl, but he had this sinking feeling that something was wrong, and so relatively quickly he left to get police. Police show up, they launch the search. For 3 days they combed the entire area, and there was just not a sign of Carl anywhere. On the 3rd day, Henry discovered Carl's body. He was lying motionless face down in a clearing in the woods. Initially, Henry thought maybe he was still alive, so he ran over to him and rolled him over, and very quickly realized that no, Carl was deceased. However, there weren't any obvious injuries to Carl's body. He had some minor scratching on his arms and on his hands, but that was about it. Henry looked around the area and he found Carl's rifle that was loaded leaning up against a tree 70 feet away from where Carl was. Next to his rifle on the ground was an expended shell casing. Also, around Carl's body were apparently huge bear tracks. The official cause of death was baffling. Carl apparently was squeezed to death to the point where his rib broke and punctured his lung. So the theory became Carl must have been out here by himself. He encountered a black bear. He fired one shot at the black bear. Thinking it was down, he walked over to check, and the bear attacked him and squeezed him and killed him. The end. But not so fast. If Carl encountered a black bear and fired one shot into the animal based on the one found shell casing, that one shot is not going to be enough to put that animal down. Or very rarely is one shot going to be enough to put down a black bear. And Carl, being a hunter, he would know that. And he would want to keep some distance with his weapon up aimed at the animal in case he needed to fire again. But even if Carl was really confident that one shot had taken the bear down, well, why would he risk his life by checking on the animal to make sure it's down without his gun? Why did he place it against a tree and then walk 70 feet over to this animal that if it's not dead, it poses an enormous threat to you? You're all alone and unarmed with a huge bear that you've shot? No one's gonna do that. You're gonna carry your gun. But even if all of that happened, that Carl, unarmed, approached this bear thinking it was dead, but the bear's not dead, he's lying in wait and he leaps up and attacks Carl. Even if that happened, black bears don't squeeze people to death. They might scratch you and bite you and rip you to pieces, but they don't squeeze you to death. And Carl only had light scratching on his wrists and on his hands. He did not have any signs of a traditional bear attack. So either this is the first time in the history of black bears that a black bear squeezed a person to death, or something else squeezed Carl. But what kind of an animal is, one, so strong it can squeeze a man's chest to the point where it breaks his ribs, and two, happens to be roaming around the Bennington Triangle? Makes you wonder. Ape Canyon is a gorge on the southeast portion of Mount St. Helens in the American state of Washington. The canyon is so named after a group of miners alleged that ape men, aka Bigfoot, attacked their cabin there in 1924. And if you want to learn more about that specific event, I covered it on my YouTube channel in an earlier video. It's right here. It's called Scariest Bigfoot Attacks, and I'll also include a link in the description. And while some people believe there are literally ape men running around this gorge on Mount St. Helens, there's never been a confirmed sighting. However, there was an event in 1950 that forced the general public to come to terms with the idea that there could be ape men running around Ape Canyon, or at least a large predator somewhere out there. In 1950, 32-year-old Jim Carter was a member of the National Ski Patrol at a ski area called the Milwaukee Bowl, which is in the state of Washington. Like everybody else on the ski patrol, Jim was a highly skilled skier and mountaineer. In May of that year, Jim was a part of a 20-person climbing party from Seattle, Washington. Their plan was to go to Mount St. Helens, hike up above the tree line, pick a spot, and then ski back down again. So the group arrives at Mount St. Helens, they hike up the mountain, they reach the spot where they want to ski down from, they sit down, they're putting their skis on, and Jim puts his on, and he says to the group, hey, why don't I ski down a little ways? I'll set up my camera on a tripod, and I'll take a picture of you guys as you pass, and then I'll follow you down to the bottom. And the group said, great, that sounds awesome. And Jim wanted to use his camera, so it was a win-win. So Jim, in full view of the entire group as they're getting ready, he skis down a little ways and then turns left into an area called Dog's Head, which was a little bit flatter than the area they were in, so probably a better spot to set up his tripod. But as soon as he turned left into that area, he was out of view of the main group. So after a few minutes, as the group is getting their stuff on, they took a little bit longer because they're trying to time it so they all leave at the same time because they want to get this picture all at once. And so they take a little bit extra time, they're all ready, and then finally they head down and they make that left. They're going to pass by Dog's Head specifically so Jim can take their picture. But when they bank around the corner, Jim's not there. And so they're looking around and they're saying to each other, did he tell us he was going somewhere else? Because it seemed an awful lot like he was going to Dog's Head, but obviously he's not here. And so someone said, well, maybe he got annoyed with us because we were taking so long to get ready up there and he just already went to the bottom. And so they agreed that's what he did. And so they got back together again and they headed down to the bottom. But when they got to the bottom, Jim wasn't there. And so they sat there for a few extra minutes looking up at the mountain, and they're kind of scanning down at the bottom and they're looking all over the place, but there's no sign of Jim. And so the group started to get really worried and they contacted authorities. When the first search team arrived, they went up to the area where the group thought Jim had been setting up at Dog's Head. And as they were looking around, all they could find was this discarded film box. So not any film or camera inside, just a box that would have held the film. It was kind of buried in the snow. Near this film box, they found Jim Carter's ski tracks, and they were not angled south towards the bottom of the mountain where the whole ski group had gone. They were angled east towards Ape Canyon. And they followed Jim's tracks, and they said they never deviated. They were total straight lines, like he was not trying to slow down. In fact, he was trying to go as fast as he possibly could. And at some point, he began leaping over these huge ice crevasses that if you mistimed, it's a death sentence. You're going into the crevasse. And he didn't just jump over one. He jumped over 2, 3, 4 at full speed without slowing down. And then his tracks got all the way to the edge where it overlooked Ape Canyon, and he went flying off. When the head of the search team saw this crazy ski line from Jim Carter, he said to the media that the only reason a guy like Jim, an expert skier who would never take risks like this, the only reason he would be skiing like this is if his life was in danger or if he was being pursued. So the search teams moved down into Ape Canyon, and for 5 days, 75 people combed the entirety of Ape Canyon up and back over and over and over again. They never found Jim, and they never found his skis or his camera or anything. And the whole time they were looking, those 75 searchers would report that anytime they were alone, they had the distinct feeling they were being watched. And it got so uncomfortable for many of them that they refused to go back into the gorge unless they had someone right next to them. After those 5 days of searching almost exclusively inside of Ape Canyon, they spent another 5 days not only continuing to search Ape Canyon, but also the surrounding areas. And finally, after 10 days of finding no trace of Jim Carter, the search was terminated. The only rational thing thing investigators could point to as the reason behind why this happened to Jim was he was diabetic and he had forgotten his insulin that day, so perhaps he became hypoglycemic and he became confused and then managed to ski off the cliff into Ape Canyon, where he landed in such a way that he remained hidden. Or, like the head of the search party seems to think, he was being pursued. He was skiing for his life. Whatever was chasing him had scared him so badly that he was skiing in a straight line down a cliff, jumping over ice crevasses before falling into Ape Canyon. And then presumably whatever forced him off the edge went down and scooped him up and took him away, and that's why they couldn't find him. But unless someone finds his body or finds some other piece of compelling evidence, we will probably never know for sure what happened to Jim Carter. Somewhere out in the Sierra Nevada mountain range lies a small hunting camp that's been there since the 1950s. Despite its fame, only a handful of people know exactly where this camp is. But even if you were given explicit directions on how to get there, you might just walk past it because it's tucked away in the middle of the woods up on this mountain. It's just a small fire pit, a couple of logs around it, another log set up for cutting wood, and there's some paths that have been beaten down over the years from its occupants, but it's pretty much unremarkable. According to camp members, the fastest way to get to the site is by horseback, and it's approximately 8 miles, and it's through very rugged terrain on this mountain, and it includes a 4,000-foot elevation gain. However, this 8-mile trail is not marked, and every year it changes slightly because trees will fall along the way, changing the topography. Ron Moorhead, who's one of the 4 original camp members, laments the fact that anybody knows anything about this campsite. He wishes they could have kept it a secret. But he knew that wasn't an option after what they discovered there in late 1971. In early 1971, Ron was a young man and he was invited out for the first time to the Sierra camp by the 3 founding members. When Ron got there, he fell in love. It was this beautiful, natural, pristine wilderness that overlooked this amazing valley, and they're surrounded by these huge white fir trees. There's a freshwater stream that trickled by, and in terms of hunting, the deer were plentiful. Ron said this campsite was the closest to heaven he thinks he'll ever get. The only real drawback of the site was the large bear population, but they always had guns on them, and they built this shelter out of heavy fallen timbers that they could go inside, shut the door, and they'd be protected from the bears until they left. When there wasn't a bear threat, they slept on the ground in tents. In late 1971, Ron came back to the camp with the other 3 founding members. They'd had a great day of hunting, and they were standing around the campfire just chatting with each other when they started hearing a grunting sound not far away from them in the forest. Now, typically, whenever a bear came to their campsite, it was usually at night, and they would hear it grunting somewhere off in the forest. And as soon as they heard it, they would stop and they would listen to kind of confirm it was a bear. And if it was, they would go inside of their shelter and they would wait for it to leave. But this time, when they stopped to listen to confirm it was a bear, the sound they heard next was something they had never heard before. And it was so frightening, they almost fell over each other running to get inside of the shelter. It was like a whooping sound you would expect from an ape, except instead of a series of whoops like you would expect from an ape, it was one loud whoop, and then silence, and then another creature somewhere else made a responding whoop that sounded different than the first. There was at least 2 creatures that were basically speaking to each other out in the forest out of view. Ron would say, as these creatures were howling and whooping at each other out in the forest, the men were huddled around inside of the shelter looking at each other like, what is that? Has anybody heard that sound before? And nobody knew what it was. And after a little while, they heard these creatures running towards the camp. They were pretty well off, but they heard these heavy footsteps approaching. And so Ron and the others, they put themselves up against these slats inside of the shelter where they could look out in the direction where these creatures were, and they're staring out just past the light of their campfire into the dark forest, and they hear these things running, and they stop. They don't come into the clearing. It's like they're just outside of where they could see, and then their tone completely changes. These creatures, which are now one on one side of the camp and one on the other, begin speaking to each other in a language that almost sounds human, but it was nonsensical. It sounded like an imitation of a human language, but not human. And so Ron and the others are terrified, and they're just staring through the slats, waiting to see this creature that's going to emerge at some point, but it never does. Instead, the creatures continue to stay outside of the light, and they move around behind their shelter out of view. And so Ron and the others move to the very middle of their shelter to get as far away from the walls as they can, because there are breaks in the walls, and they're worried one of these things is going to reach through and grab them. But finally, after hours of these creatures running around the perimeter of their camp, communicating in this totally otherworldly language, they start started whooping again and ran off. And for the rest of the night, Ron and the other three stayed right in that shelter. The next day, when the sun came up, the men were out of that camp as fast as they could. These are hard, rugged men, and they were very shaken up by this experience. And they tried to talk about it, but there was just no way to describe what they were hearing and experiencing. And so they just decided they just wanted to get out of there as fast as possible, and they'll deal with this later. But as soon as they got out of the woods and back to their homes, they didn't talk about it anymore, except Ron became obsessed with whatever it was that was making that sound. He so desperately wanted to find out what it was. And so he convinced the other three members to come with him and go back to the campsite, except this time Ron was going to bring an audio recorder and he was going to try to capture some audio of these creatures. And so the four men went back to the campsite. They didn't even hunt that day. They stayed right near the campsite. They made this big fire and they're all just kind of nervously sitting there waiting, kind of hoping it happens and also hoping it doesn't happen. And at some point in the evening, Ron said he heard footsteps way out in the middle of the forest and they sounded like they were running towards the camp. The four men sprint inside the shelter, lock it behind them, and Ron turns on the audio recorder. Now, before you listen to this famous recording, here are its bona fides. After being recorded, Ron sent it to Dr. R. Lynn Curlin, who is a professor of electrical engineering at the University of Wyoming, and he and his team analyzed it, and they concluded that 1, it was unaltered, so it's not been edited, it's not been doctored in any way, it's an authentic audio recording. And 2, whatever was making the sounds could not have been a man, because their vocal range was dramatically higher and lower than that of a human's. The doctor said, based on average pitch and tract length, the creature that was making the sound most likely was between 7'3" and 8 feet tall. In addition to the Dr. Curlin examination, a cryptolinguist expert named Scott Nelson also pointed out that it would have been nearly impossible in 1971 for Ron or any of the other hunters to dub the sound of their voices, which are on the recording, over the sounds that these creatures were making, because a couple times in the recording you hear both sets of voices happening at once. That's something you couldn't have done in 1971. Despite numerous attempts to debunk this recording, it still stands as a legitimate, unedited recording, although what they were recording is still a mystery. Have a listen.
There's 2 of them across the creek at the big rocks. It's a hard act to follow.
He sounds like he talks to us and they talk to each other.
Yeah. Right there, just seen movement right through there.
Shortly after this recording was made, Ron stopped hunting at this camp. However, over the years, he has gone back several times because he's obsessed with trying to find out what's out in the forest. But he says to this day, he still has no idea. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's video, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please go over to the like button's house on the next really hot day and ask them to get you a cold drink. While they're gone, put a large raw salmon in their AC vent. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.